Hey guys, Chris here from Work to Game, Gaming Kinda, and now Gaming Kinda TV over on Facebook as well. That means that if you are watching this, it is October 13th or later, so I can finally share everything we learned from the media tour, but I do have a couple of disclaimers. First of all, Yoshi P opened his statement to us by saying a thank you to the medical staff over the last few years, and I would like to echo his thoughts. You've been asked of a lot in the fight over the last few years, and if 14 can help be a way to connect with friends or relax after a long day, then I am happy that I can share what we now know about Endwalker coming up very soon, and the devs hope that in some small way that can be a thank you and a place for you to enjoy and appreciate all that you do. Second, a disclaimer about the content itself. We were given brief access to a development build of Endwalker. Any footage I used from this time is development footage and will be labeled as such. Any of this is subject to change, any tooltips, any potencies, anything I show as they put the finishing touches on Endwalker may be subject to adjustments. So as part of talking about physical ranged, one of the first things I'd like to stop and take care of is the role actions. These are the things that they all share, and then just is there anything that's going to generally affect them on an individual job basis, but that really kind of unifies them. So as we go through the role actions, leg graze, slowing targets down their movement speed by applying heavy, second wind, instantly allowing yourself to heal yourself, foot graze, binding the target, Peloton, allowing movement outside of battle. The interruption of a target's action with head graze and arm's length, nullifying knockback and draw-in effects, as well as applying a slow when struck, which reduces the swing speed of enemies. All 6 are identical. This is not true of every single role, but all 6 are identical. Paired with this, because this is physical ranged, I would like to make a note that the physical parity and the magical, that they're back and forth. When they moved over from 1.0 into a Realm Reborn, those were calculated a little bit differently. Imagine them each having a coefficient that they were both multiplied by. And so you have your potency on the tooltip, this imaginary multiplier, your attributes, which we know got stat squished, and that determines the final outgoing damage, which of course is affected by any mitigation on the thing receiving the damage, and that's the amount of damage done. Those coefficients were different for magical and physical, so they did bring physical up to be in line with magical, so that means that if you don't want the number at the end of the equation to go up just across the board universally, by basically nullifying those coefficients so that they're identical now, the potencies on the physical abilities do have to be reduced. And so if you are somebody that shares their time across maybe a caster and a phys ranged, just note that some of the potency reductions that you see within physical could be just that excess potency being pulled out of the system. We don't know exactly how that's applied. Is it applied universally across all of the abilities within a job, or do they say, here's the total amount of potency per second that a job is doing, let's kind of pull it out in the areas that we think it is best pulled out. We don't know how it got there, but we do know that physical jobs were going to need to receive some sort of potency nerf that isn't going to change the outgoing amount of damage you have. That's to keep you from accidentally receiving some crazy level buff. And so that's the big universal physical ranged changes. Your physical counterparts, melee and tanks, they get to now do ranged attacks without breaking melee combos, but there isn't really anything universal like that here. As a matter of fact, this was the role that described in the live letter was seen as, they use the word orthodox with the changes. So it is something where all 3 of these jobs should feel relatively in line with how they did in Shadowbringers. Bard being the one that I think people wanted the most from, and the one that the live letter went the least over, and also the one that they noted would have the most still to go, and they were showing media tour build footage, so it is possible that some of the adjustments, if I had to guess, to things like Bard might not be done, but this should be a pretty good initial showing with what they showed us at the media tour. So just keep in mind, this is all here to flex. It should feel like an extension of, these should feel like quality of life adjustments to phys ranged, and this is just kind of the universal truths that are going to group regardless of which physical range job you're in particular honing in on. If you have the equipment for the role and you're spending your time jumping across all 3, you need to know this basic almost lack of information to have some context for where your job might go from here, since at a role level, there isn't a big personality shift like there is with healers being split in two, or with some of the universal changes that are being applied to tanks and to melee. This is really a role where there wasn't that big overhaul, and it didn't have something like Summoner just totally messing with the caster category. This category, when we talk about role actions being so orthodox and so plain, that's actually a pretty good summary for the just generic general improvement. I think all three of these jobs got better. And when we talk about the physical ranged versus Shadowbringers, but I am just rambling about the fact that they didn't change. So coming off the role actions, Dancer. To start, I'm going to note that this job, as well as the others that I talked about in this section, physical ranged, is not where I'm a main tank, and so this is a pretty big departure for me. So I'm going to report on this the way I would a live letter, and we're going to break this down into what did not change, what got weaker, what did change, meaning it got stronger or just different, and then talk about the new stuff. So with what did not change, what is staying the exact same? Standard step. This did not change, but the act of dancing got cleaner with your AoE and single target buttons, as far as just the way your hotbars are utilized. This will be most noticeable to people who already feel that they're crammed on the number of buttons they feel comfortable pressing while moving or things like that, or for controller players. Technical step did not change either, but just note that across the board, this is also going to feel cleaner, especially for players that really feel like I need to be in a hotbar mindset for AoE or a hotbar mindset for single target, and they're having trouble kind of jumping back and forth for the steps. The steps, imboete, in entrechat, jet, pirouette, however you say all of those, they didn't change. But they are going to appear on your AoE buttons as well. That's what the change is. They're on your single target buttons like they always were. They're now also on your AoE buttons. So you're going to have two different buttons that push each one. And what that's going to allow for is if you're in AoE and you press a step, you're going to stay on those AoE buttons if that's what's most convenient for you. If you're in single target, you're going to stay on those single targets. If you want to keep doing it the way you can do it, they're identical buttons. It's just offering another way to feel comfortable. Fan Dance 1 and 2 did not change, but the proc duration extended from 20 to 30 seconds. So this is something that we're seeing across the board. Combos, now you have 30 seconds before the combo thing falls off. We're seeing melee make it to where tanks and melee are no longer breaking combos with their ranged attacks. We're seeing proc, when something procs and you have a certain amount of time to press an ability like this or like on Bard, those are extending. And so this is right in line with that, extending from 20 to 30 seconds. We're going to see this repeatedly, so just expect that to be on just about everything. 3 doesn't have a duration, so it's just literally identical here. And on Vaunt didn't change. So there's lots of movement being added across other jobs. So I would expect encounters to be something that we see a lot more movement in this time around. So while it did not change, it may feel more useful or a bigger part of your life than it did before. That would not surprise me. We'll just have to see. Curing Waltz did not change. Closed Position did not change, but I think Dance Partner is something that really didn't need to change. That's one of the things that I think people would want to just hold on to the way it is. Keep in mind that the proc names swapped to make it cleaner, but they didn't really seem to make an actual difference. We saw this also on things like Warrior, where now, because their proc ability used to be tied to an ability, so that proc was named after that ability, now that multiple things can trigger it, it needs its own proc name, but it's doing the same thing. So with that, let's move into what got weaker. Let's get the bad news out of the way. Keep in mind that physical potencies were reduced because of a back-end change that brought behind-the-scenes numbers in line with magical. So some part or any of the reduction might not actually be a lower potency. It might just be keeping the job where it was. We don't know what that percentage is. Just kind of keep that in the back of your head, especially if you're spending your time between here and a magical class. Cascade went from 250 down to 180. Note that the proc will go up to that 30 seconds. Proc window's getting longer all over the place. Fountain, while the base potency did not drop, the combo potency did drop from 300 to 240, which is another trend we're seeing, where people who are just learning a job and make a mistake, they will not suffer from base potencies dropping. Those are getting pushed up, and many times due to traits So that won't necessarily be true in all synced content, but max level characters are going to see a base potency there, but then the combo potency drops down. So people who are executing perfect rotations are no longer being rewarded by as much of a potency difference, but they're being rewarded by other things, because a lot of these jobs got new stuff added that you're going to get to see more of if you're doing your job correctly. Windmill dropped from 150 to 100. That's a massive percentage reduction. Proc window up to 30. So just note that that's the quality of life adjustment across the board. With this upgrading like Cascade, so you can either use AoE or single target. So this is going to be the first of those that you're going to see those upgrading. Reverse Cascade from 300 down to 240. Another 20% drop. These percentages felt large, but I also, we've seen that across Machinist and on Bard. I think it'll all add up by the time it's done, because we are adding new stuff. It's hard to say just off of a dummy on a tour. So this is kind of where the idea is, and all these potencies are subject to change. But I expect the mentality of these abilities to be the thing that continues through into November. Blade Shower continues the pattern. Base potency stays. This time a 30% drop in combo potency, and the duration extended. We'll just keep calling this the usual. And so Fountain Fall got the usual, but only a 15% reduction there. So better. And now that I've mentioned the standard and technical step, skill step, technical and standard step as skills did not change, but executing them was cleaner on the hotbar. The standard and technical finish, however, did change. Both lost potency, and the technical finish now has a flourishing piece added on it to the end. And that's going to allow one of the new abilities to be used. We'll get there. Saber Dance dropped from 600 to 480. Just a big drop. Now let's talk about what just is different. Rising Windmill just changed. It used to do a heavy hit of 300 to the first target and 50% less remaining. Now it's just a flat 140 all the way around. This button also upgrades, just a reminder. Blood Shower got the exact same thing, doing 350 to the first, and now it's going to be down to 180, but that's going to be 180 to everybody. Shield Samba dropping from 120 down to just 90 seconds. We're seeing some cooldowns adjust down to 90, 60s, 30s where it makes sense. That's not all abilities, but that is a relatively standard thing on recast timers. Devilment mostly stayed the same, but wanted to note here that it grants Flourishing Starfall for 30 seconds, and we're going to need to hold on to that buff for at least 30 seconds while we get to the new section. Flourish looks different, but only because the effect name changed. Otherwise, it's the same, but I did want to note that here. Those effect names changing, what you're seeing up there in the proc, that's going to be something you're going to see on jobs where they're trying to clean up what triggers what. They're saying, hey, multiple things might be able to trigger this, or this is something you're tracking across AoE and single target. Let's give it its own name. So we're seeing across the board where things are just getting cleaned up so that it doesn't get so confusing when you're like, well, I didn't use that ability. The perks are getting cleaner names. Improvisation is likely one of the single biggest differences in a single ability on Dancer, and now wants you to stack with as many friends as possible. That's the change. So, what is new? Fan Dance 4. 1 and 2 are under Fourfold Feathers. 3 is under Flourishing Fan Dance, and now we have a Fourfold Fan giving us a new Fan Dance cone that we can use. Now, when you finish Technical Finish, we're going to get a buff that will let us perform Tilana with the Technical Finish button on your bar simply being pressed one more time. Upgrading buttons and having things with traits, that's the trend. This is Trait Walker. We are swapping things out with traits. We're not putting more buttons to bloat. We're saying, hey, you're only using that button every once in a while. Now, you would never be using these at the same time because you would have to trigger this first and then press that. So why don't you just have that button pressed one additional time in your rotation? We get more use out of the same number of buttons, not just add this enormous number of buttons that you each press only one time every however many seconds. Devilment added an effect called Flourishing Starfall, okay, remember? And that's going to let us use Starfall Dance. This is a line AoE. This is our level 90 ability, and it's going to be the big shiny thing that you saw in the job action trailer. Across the board, I will say what I appreciate about Dancer is that I've always enjoyed it, but it takes me a second to kind of get into the flow. It takes me a second to get into it, and when I'm seeing things proc where like I know what procs I'm looking for, and I'm I'm just jumping around. And once I'm there, like I know as I push a button, this is what I'm looking for, and this is where we're going next. And you've got a surprisingly large amount of range for how the animations look, in my opinion. Then I'm jumping in and I'm doing AoE, and like it all just takes a moment for me to settle into. And one of the things I think they did here is they have a lot more buttons that are going to just create an additional way for whatever feels natural on your control scheme. There are just additional ways to get to the same space on the steps, and there's more use of the same buttons. So I think without adding more buttons, there's more going on. This is not, in my opinion, as much a rotation-based job as it is more of a reaction-based job, as opposed to something that's much more linear where I could write out the order. When you think about like crafters, there are, expert crafting, you're looking for those proc rates, but a lot of crafts can be done with a macro, and it's the same abilities in order regardless of situation. Dancer feels more on that expert end where you're waiting to, I know my general intention and we'll figure it out when we get there. And so I think giving my hotbars more of an understanding where it can line up with that mentality is something that I really appreciate. I think Dancer, in my opinion, feels the best out of the new physical ranged. As far as like, we had very little time to play, and you hop on a dummy, you glance through your skills to see what looks different, you read the new ones, you read the new traits, and then you just start swinging at a dummy, and it immediately felt good. It immediately felt like at home, and considering it isn't a tank, so it's not where I spend most of my time, it was the DPS job that most readily gave in to me casting the new abilities. They all felt very, very natural. I was a Black Mage main from ARR through Stormblood, and Dancer honestly felt more at home than Black Mage did on its first couple minutes. It took me a second to adjust to the new Black Mage changes. And so I think Dancer just felt logical. It feels like somebody just looked at the way somebody plays and looked at like what buttons they push by accident and then asked themselves, okay, but was that a logical reason that they were pushing that button, or was it just a mechanical failure? If there was a logical reason, oh, well, they're in AoE and they want to stay in AoE, well, let's just give them a way to do that. Oh, that button's not getting used very often. We want to add more features, and it's in the mindset of that button. Let's just put that there. And so I think this, like Gunbreaker, it's just there's more going on, and we're going to do it without adding a whole bunch of buttons to the bar. We're just going to clean it up a little. And I think that's going to feel really nice for a job that has so much movement available. It is so flexible on where it is and when it gets there. I think that having that freedom is going to be really, really nice. I find myself on Dancer moving just for the sake of moving. I do feel myself just dancing around the arena, especially in like normal content. If I'm in an MSQ roulette or something, I just find myself just killing time. And I find Dancer a really fun job to just constantly be covering distance just because I can. And I think this is just only going to line up with that. I don't know which of these three jobs is the big winner. In my opinion, Dancer is the one I'm most excited to play in Endwalker out of Fizz Ranged. But that's just my personal opinion. It's not like I'm going to slot in Savage as a Fizz Ranged anyway. So, I look forward to seeing what kind of Fizz Ranged mains are drawn to here. And kind of how they feel with the Dancer changes, because I do think physical ranged is more of a feeling and less of looking at these potencies and saying, okay, that's going to move this ability to this ability, and that's going to feel weird. It's a lot more about these kind of proc rates and managing things and getting in there and taking advantage of how mobile they are and buffing your allies. And it just, when people ask for a utility job, it feels like Fizz Ranged has the downtime to do it. And so I look forward to seeing what people think of Dancer.